Before this, I was doing my PhD at UC Santa Cruz, where my work really focuses on restoration outcomes, incorporating management perspectives, and how to adapt practices for climate change. And prior to that, I used to work in restoration at the Cheadle Center for Biodiversity and Ecological Restoration at UC Santa Barbara. And yeah, today I'll be talking a little bit more about my research from UC Santa Cruz, assessing some of the outcomes of restored coastal grasslands from Santa Barbara to Humboldt. And just before we get started, I also just want to briefly mention that there is a draft EIR comment period for the Juristaic area, which is a really important area for the Amamutsin tribe. And so I recommend, or I ask that if you have time and expertise, for you to put in an expert comment to help protect some of this environment, or at least require mitigation and open access, tribal access. And with that, I will get started. Sorry. Okay, so my name is Justin Luong, and I'll be talking more about my research from UC Santa Cruz with my advisors, Dr. Daniel Press and Dr. Karen Hull. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach me at my UCSC email, jluong, L-U-O-N-G 4 @ucsc.edu. I see a lot of familiar names in the participants and also a lot of new names. I welcome you all, and thanks for coming to my talk. And I'll be talking a little bit more about restoration outcomes of California coastal grasslands. Before we get started, I want to do some acknowledgements to thank all the people that helped contribute to my work, especially the land managers that help facilitate access, as well as all my student assistants and field assistants, and my generous funding support. I also want to mention and acknowledge that the research presented here, it was undertaken on the unceded territory of numerous indigenous peoples that were violently removed, including, but not limited to, the Chumash, Selenian, Amamutsin, Ohlone, Miwok, Pomo, and Wiyot tribes that are today working towards decolonization and some traditional land stewardship. So, why do we care about California coastal grasslands? They're a small sliver of the 1% of remaining native grasslands in California, and they're often dominated by perennial bunch grasses and annual forbs. And they're unique because they receive summertime fog, which provides some drought relief and allows perennials to continue growing, and also supports a unique diversity of species. And so as you guys drive through the highway or Highway 101 and along Highway 1, you might see that there's still a lot of green grass. And a lot of times those are areas that are native with stipropulchra and other native grasses that can take advantage of this late season moisture from the fog and really continue to grow. However, coastal prairies are increasingly affected by land development, which can directly replace habitat. Land development can also contribute to indirect loss of coastal grasslands by increasing habitat fragmentation, changing disturbance patterns, and facilitating non-native and sometimes noxious species invasions. Because coastal grasslands in California are often located in a legally designated county coastal zone, they often require compensatory or statutory mitigation mandated through the California Coastal Commission or through county general plans. California coastal grasslands also host a really high amount of species diversity. And California grasslands in general host about over 70% of California's threatened and endangered plant species. And California coastal grasslands are thought to be one of the most diverse types of grasslands in all of North America, mostly made up of, and this diversity is mostly contributed from, a vast amount of different types of forbs that are annual and perennial. And this makes coastal grasslands in California a really important area of interest for biodiversity conservation, because we are a biodiversity hotspot in California, and we do want to figure out how we can restore and conserve and protect our important and vast biodiversity resources in the future. Aside from that, this biodiversity also helps support all types of ecosystem functioning, such as pollination networks and soil carbon sequestration. And grasslands are often also even thought of as more climate resilient in terms of carbon storage compared to other systems, because a lot of their growth is below ground compared to above ground, like in forests. And even though trees have a lot of below and above ground, grasses, I talk about them as like below ground forests, and they have most of their growth below ground. So for example, if an extreme drought comes through or a fire comes through, it'll burn all the above ground biomass, or the plant material, and it'll release that carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. And you can imagine with a forest, that will be a lot of material. But in a grassland, there's not as much material standing on the ground. So when a fire comes through or a major drought causes die-off, not as much carbon dioxide is released respectively. And a lot of that carbon is stored safely underground, where it could contribute to long-term carbon storage and sequestration. However, California grasslands are also experiencing what we call perennialization, which is the increased dominance and abundance of perennial species. So here you can see all types of beautiful native wildflowers that are annual and perennial. But if we take away a lot of the annual plants, we'll be left more with a composition like this, which often favors perennial grasses, some perennial forbs that are really hardy, and rushes and sedges that are also perennial. And so this is something that we also probably want to think about a little bit more in the future as we continue to do restoration efforts and thinking about how to not just restore native habitat, but how to restore a diverse amount of native habitat with a rich amount of species. Restoration is also a growing priority, both locally and globally. Increasingly, there are interdisciplinary stakeholder meetings that result in initiatives calling for the protection and restoration of biodiversity. For example, globally, we have the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is an international committee that helps set global goals for biodiversity protection. And more recently, the UN also declared 2021 to 2030 the decade for ecological restoration, with ambitious goals to conserve 30% of the Earth's surface by 2030, which will likely also require restoration to achieve that target. More locally, Governor Newsom also adopted a similar plan for California in 2020. We also have the California Coastal Act locally, which was passed in 1976, which mandates the restoration of coastal areas that are affected by coastal development. And we also have the California Biodiversity Initiative from 2018, which places greater protections and emphasis on protecting, conserving, and restoring our native flora and fauna. Some studies have even shown that local community members are even willing to pay into restorations for restoration projects, as long as the restoration is going to occur locally and not elsewhere. Because oftentimes in these surveys, they recognize that restoration contributes to their well-being and also ecosystem services of the surrounding area. However, there's still a lot of variability in restoration. And so on the photo on the right here, you can see 3 different photos of one grassland that I monitored. And you can see that it really varies really widely. And that's often because there's really different abiotic or environmental characteristics within the soil and even little microclimates with the weather. And then also with biotic interactions or biological interactions between plants and other plants or plants and insects and other organisms. So you can see how much variability there is. And a lot of times this is because restoration projects often lack funds or sufficient funds to really conduct post-implementation and pre-implementation monitoring, which really prevents them from knowing the true characteristics of the environment and really selecting the most appropriate plants for that environment, and then how to consider interannual variability, which is also really variable in California, which is rain between years. So this really makes it difficult. And because we also don't know what's happening with restoration projects because we don't have post-implementation monitoring, we don't really even know if a lot of times these restoration projects are successful based on even the project-based goals. And projects that do have money to monitor often are only able to monitor shortly after implementation, or at the very most up to 5 years after implementation. And this is really only for statutory or legally mandated projects. And beyond 5 years, we really don't know what's happening with project-based and not research-based restoration projects. Experimental restoration studies do show a variety of ecosystems have high variability, which often is caused by, again, environmental variability, as well as limited knowledge about the system and insufficient knowledge about local natural history, which really informs whether or not a plant will do well in a certain environment or a microhabitat. Ecological restoration is also a management tool and action that requires direct human intervention. And as such, it will be directly shaped by the people or the person undertaking the restoration project. It's been shown in various studies that socioeconomic and political factors really play a strong role in defining ecological outcomes, and especially more so in projects that are human dominated with human intervention, like restoration. For example, the surrounding parcels nearby the restoration project and their views and perspectives may influence how an agency undertakes restoration at their site, or may even limit the tools a practitioner may be able to implement. For example, some areas have really high concerns with herbicide, and so that may restrict certain management tools that are effective for really hardy invasive species. In other areas, it may be hard to implement prescribed fires, which a lot of practitioners are interested in using these days, but often it's really hard to get permitting, or sometimes even due to community action. On the other hand, a land manager's interest or influence may also drive or generate or create restoration projects, whereas uninterested people might try to pursue other types of conservation projects with extra funds. Somewhere that has access to machinery from nearby agricultural parcels may use similar practices as nearby farmers, or in some cases, from stories I've heard, they may even use and borrow the tools from nearby farmers and use their transplanting tractors and do restoration in that type of way. Whereas agencies with high staff or volunteer labor, like national parks or well-staffed national parks like the Golden Gate National Recreational Area, may do more hand removal with volunteer labor and really be able to do a lot of what we call micro-weeding and really kind of focus on a particular site and project over time for a really long and dedicated amount of time. Some projects will even have different species preferences or different landscape aesthetics due to personal preferences. And as such, management practices greatly differ across agencies and sometimes even within the same agency across practitioners. Accordingly, restoration project goals also differ between projects, and goals may also differ depending on whether or not a project is statutory, meaning it's legally mandated and required, or non-statutory, meaning it's not legally mandated and essentially is a voluntary project. The commonality that does continue to tie these projects together, though, is that they tend to be fund limited. It's also hard to address the variability in restoration because of a critical science practice gap. This gap leads to research and management practice that are not always synergistic. And this is often because research may not always consider a management perspective and oftentimes will produce research that maybe has already been addressed by on-the-ground practice, or potentially even make research that may not be feasible in terms of cost and labor. And this is due to oftentimes a lack of communication. And this results in research that may not readily match management problems or local environments. This gap is also facilitated by differing goals and resource levels used for restoration research compared to practice. For example, research can, like I mentioned, generate expensive labor-intensive suggestions that are not always feasible for practice, such as for potentially measuring traits and then using that for plant selection. Furthermore, research is often focused in theoretical frameworks and is technical and not always necessarily relevant to land management problems in a local environment. So the gap is also even exacerbated by hard to access publish, which is often behind paywalls, if not directly shared with managers. And so it's really important to really think about how to incorporate a management perspective when doing our research, and especially in something like assessing restoration outcomes, which is completed completely by land managers and restoration practitioners. So to better understand how coastal grassland restoration outcomes fared years later, I asked 4 questions. Does coastal grassland restoration meet project-based goals and a standard performance metric? Is native cover related to project age? What are the biggest barriers and to achieving restoration goals? And what are the most common methods used to improve native cover and species richness or diversity? To answer these questions, I identified 37 restoration projects spanning along a 1,000 kilometer north-south climate gradient from Santa Barbara to Humboldt County. To locate projects, I first contacted universities and colleges and nature preserves in these areas to see if they knew of any projects. I then also contacted land trusts nonprofits and other research areas to see if they had completed any restoration or knew of any nearby projects. I then also reached out to my previous contacts in restoration in some of these areas, as well as identifying new local restoration agencies. And initially, I contacted about 150 people from this search, which eventually led me to make new contacts. And I ended up talking to around 200 people to select these 37 sites. I later learned through interviews, which I'll discuss later, that there could be up to 48 sites that fit my criteria that could have been surveyed, indicating I roughly surveyed about 2/3 of existing restored coastal grasslands that fit the criteria in this range. The selection criteria for these projects were projects that were at least 3 years post-implementation in 2019, were actively planted or seeded with native species. The site size was larger than 1 acre, and the site was a coastal prairie or coastal grassland, which means it received summertime coastal fog. I selected projects 3 years and older because first-year results can often vary widely, and plants may experience high mortality, or in some cases grow slow and not achieve higher cover until later years. The project I identified ranged from 3 to 33 years post-implementation by 2019, and ranged from 1 to 32 acres in size. I conducted vegetation surveys from 2019 to 2021. In 2019, I surveyed 32 sites, the first ones I identified. In 2020, I couldn't gain access to all the sites due to COVID-19 and sampled about 20 sites. And in 2021, I resurveyed almost all the original sites, and then also 5 additional projects that I identified from management interviews, totaling for 34 sites that year. I estimated at every single one of these sites the absolute plant cover using 1/4 meter quadrats every 5 meters along 50-meter transects. I used a range from 3 to 16 transects at these sites, scaled to the site size. I then estimated the absolute plant cover, which considers overlapping levels of plants, because oftentimes in a dense grassland, if you've been out, you almost have to swim through the grasses and see what's below kind of the tall grasses to really accurately to assess the diversity and cover there. And so oftentimes cover can sometimes add up to over 100%. I also collected soil samples, 3 each from every transect in 2019 to assess the soil characteristics to see if there was any relationship with success or different types of native plant covers. Before visiting any of the projects, I conducted project document analyses for all the restoration projects that had available planning documents, which was actually only about 63% of the projects. It was about 47% of the projects. I haven't updated that to the 37 number. So about only 47% of the projects actually had written documents that I was able to take any information from. And each document varied widely from between agencies and continued to contain a different amount of information depending on the agency and the author. But I extracted the information when possible about project-based goals, the baseline data for the project, implementation strategies, planting palettes and selection, and financial and labor investment. Information that could not be obtained from document analyses were then I obtained those information through conducting semi-structured interviews. Semi-structured interviews were conducted after all the field vegetation surveys in 2019, the first year of plant samples. I conducted semi-structured interviews with at least 1 restoration practitioner from each project. Semi-structured interviews have guiding questions, but are loosely structured so participants can lead the discussion. Because some practitioners worked on multiple projects I surveyed, they may be linked to more than 1 project. Thus, there were less than 32 interviews. When this was the case, I often try to interview at least 2 people from each project, and in total ended up interviewing 26 restoration practitioners. Interviews focused on largest barriers to achieving restoration goals, implementation strategies, and helped fill in information from projects that had no documents or missing information for the documents. And I received approval from the Institutional Review Board at UC Santa Cruz to do this human research subjects research. It's also important to note that when using these mixed qualitative and quantitative methods with, for example, interview data and plant community survey data, that the same statistical methods can't always be used. And so in this project, we really use qualitative data to help provide context and explain the findings from the quantitative vegetation surveys. So to start off with, we found a difference in the directional and numeric goals. We found about 22% of the projects had numeric-based goals that were time-bound, which means they had a goal, for example, of 20% or 30% native cover after 5 years. And then most projects actually had non-numeric directional goals, which just means they wanted to either increase native cover, increase native diversity, or decrease non-native cover, or maybe even decrease erosion. And this really does make sense because, like I mentioned, some of these projects are voluntary. And because they're voluntary, they don't really have any strict requirements that they need to meet. And so it makes sense that they just are choosing an easy to assess target that isn't as cost intensive. So from the surveys, we found from the 37 projects that restoration overall is really successful. About 80% of all the projects surveyed reached a standard performance metric of 25% native cover and at least 6 native species after 5 years. And you may be thinking, oh, 25% cover sounds kind of low, but if you have worked in grasslands before, you'll understand that it's really hard to achieve high cover in grasslands because there's so many invasive species that are competing for that cover. Whereas in other systems, such as forests, there's heavy shading, which prevents a lot of invasion. And in other areas like wetlands, there's a lot of periodic flooding or perennial flooding that also prevents invasion. And so in native grasslands, there's not really anything that filters or prevents other species from coming in. And so oftentimes there's really strong issues with invasion. And that's why we set a goal of 25% native cover, which is also in line with kind of the lower level of statutory requirements or legal requirements for restoration. So we found about 80% of these projects were successful in meeting the standard performance metric. About 6% of the projects needed a little bit more improvement, and they fell about 5% short. And 13% of the projects did not meet this target and needed to adapt, adjust, or improve their practice or methods somehow. Overall, though, if we looked at project-based goals, which again, typically was directional, we find that all but 2 projects, so about 95% of projects met their project-based goals, which is also really great news. Interestingly, we also found that more projects were voluntary compared to statutory, or at least the ones that we surveyed, even though and that's because of an issue with land access. And so there was actually an equal amount of statutory projects that we were able to identify, but we were actually denied access, and I was denied access to multiple statutory projects. And I was told by certain land managers or consultants specifically actually not to come to their project and monitor their project, even though there is a requirement for these projects to be compliant in perpetuity or basically forever. So that can be a bit potentially concerning, although I can only speculate what's happening there. And in the future, I may potentially try to gain access through the county, but in that short period, I wasn't able to anticipate that and wasn't able to get county access in that short amount of time. Another interesting fact about these voluntary and legally mandated or statutory projects is that the voluntary projects often actually achieved higher native species diversity or species richness, whereas the statutory projects or the legally mandated projects often achieved lower non-native cover compared to the voluntary ones. We found that native cover. Well, first, I just want to briefly mention that I'm going to be going through a series of correlation plots next. And it's important to remember that on these plots, the variables presented are related, but that doesn't necessarily mean one caused the other because there's so much noise and kind of other factors going in the field. We can't really say one caused the other, but we can say they're related. So overall, we found native cover range from 13 to 79% across the 37 sites we surveyed, and native species diversity or richness ranged from 5 to 60 species. We found native plant cover didn't really change with project age or significantly decline over time, which is potentially a good news. However, we found non-native plant cover range from 24 to 96%, and non-native species richness ranged from 15 to 47 species. Unfortunately, we did find a very weak correlation, 9%, where there was a positive relationship between post-implementation project age and non-native species cover, meaning that non-native species cover could potentially be related with older projects or increasing time. Additionally, we also found that native species cover was strongly and negatively correlated with non-native species cover, which is strongly supported by the literature, of course, and also supported by commentary and other conversations I've had with practitioners. But this really illustrates the importance of invasive species management and restoration, and how non-native species competition may potentially impact restoration outcomes. This may also suggest that in the future, non-native species may decrease as non-native species cover increase with post-implementation age. We also found, unfortunately, that non-native species cover was related to decreased native species richness or diversity per unit area. And again, this is likely related to competition. And so this, again, illustrates the impact of non-native species competition, not just on cover, but also native species richness, potentially in restoration projects. For the soil factors we tested plant cover and richness with various soil factors such as base exchange capacity and plant available macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and also a suite of micronutrients. We pretty much found that nothing was significant other than relationships between native plant cover and non-native plant cover with soil available nitrogen. And so on the plots below, we can see on the y-axis native cover and non-native cover, and on the x-axis, the bottom axis, is plant available nitrogen. And so with native cover, we actually find, contrary to what we would expect, native cover is increasing with higher levels of plant available nitrogen. And again, we find opposite of what we would expect, non-native cover decreasing with increasing amount of plant available nitrogen. And so this is a point that I think is really interesting, and I welcome any discussion later on. Although I've done some I've looked into this initially, and it seems that sometimes non-native plants can quickly uptake nitrogen during the growing season, whereas native plants typically are slower with taking up nitrogen, and they hold them in their leaves and then eventually release them back into the soil. And so that's why we might be seeing lower lower plant available nitrogen where there's higher non-native plant cover. We also found through interviews that restoration practitioners were increasingly confident with the achievability of restoration goals as time progressed. Before 2005, only 1 in 10 projects believed they could actually achieve their project-based goals. But after 2005, almost 70% of projects felt that they could achieve their goals. And this is a really important finding because that means restoration practice is growing as a field and in confidence, and likely adapting practices based on older projects and probably oral communication with other practitioners. We also asked practitioners if they felt the surrounding community supported their projects, and about 95% of the projects indicated, sorry, I haven't updated this number. All but 2 projects indicated that they had community support from nearby parcels or neighbors, which is really great because we really do need supportive community to really have successful restoration. We found that the implementation strategies varied greatly across restoration projects. 78% of surveyed restoration projects took some type of baseline data, but only 50% specifically took vegetative data. General data consisted mostly of photo monitoring points, but sometimes was also consisted of soil characterization or erosion tests. We also asked restoration practitioners whether or not they believed planting or seeding was better for reintroducing species to a restoration site. 31% of practitioners indicated that planting was the only and best method for restoring a site, whereas 69% of land managers and practitioners indicated that there were some types of trade-offs with planting and seeding. Most commonly, practitioners indicated there were trade-offs said that they would still prefer planting, but planting is not necessarily feasible for all projects because it's so cost intensive. Projects that are larger may be harder to plant in entirety because it requires more plant material, somewhere to grow them, and more time and labor to install them. Planting 30 acres would therefore be much more difficult than 1 acre, whereas seeding 30 acres would be much more feasible and cost effective for land management. In other instances, practitioners indicated that it may be best to seed certain annual species that do not grow well in containers or follow a prescribed disturbance. We found that intensity of post-implementation maintenance also varied across restoration projects. We found that 31% of projects had high maintenance, 50% had low, and 19% had no post-implementation restoration maintenance. Low maintenance included single targeted annual efforts of hand removal or annual mowing or grazing, and high maintenance was multiple targeted invasive species control efforts throughout the year, and potentially also replanting efforts. We also found that high intensity and low intensity maintenance were useful in actually decreasing non-native plant cover compared to no maintenance, and high level maintenance also helped increase native species diversity compared to low and no maintenance. We found that there were 3 common barriers to achieving restoration project goals. Similar to ecological data, practitioners from all projects indicated that invasive species management was the largest barrier to achieving project goals. We found that 84% of the projects indicated there was insufficient funding and that was a barrier for achieving project goals or the quality that they wish to achieve. For the 27 projects that indicated insufficient funding, 74% of these projects indicated they would have conducted post-restoration monitoring to apply adaptive management if they had sufficient funds and resources. 33% of the projects also indicated they had difficulty in sourcing enough appropriate plant material, which sometimes was caused by restriction in planting genetics or sometimes insufficient knowledge about species natural history and where to collect these species. Restoration practitioners also indicated that the ideal management actions to improve native cover was to undertake targeted weed removal. Practitioners also indicated that supplemental watering can be useful in improving native cover, especially in container plants in more arid areas or in dry years. In fact, supplemental watering was only suggested in southern and central coast sites and not at all in the northern sites, which receive more rainfall. 19% of the projects indicated that local genetics were important for improving native cover. However, use of local genetics was indicated to be controversial between land managers and practitioners. About half of the practitioners believed that using local genetics was important for improving restoration outcomes in some way, whereas the other half of practitioners believed using local genetics was unnecessary and restrictive and drove up planting sourcing costs, and in some cases made incorporating more diverse species palettes economically infeasible. About 13% of the projects indicated that reestablishing historic disturbance regimes and using pre-site treatments like grow-kill cycles could also help improve native cover. Some other notable mentions, which were also supported by the literature, but also mentioned by just one practitioner, are listed below. Practitioners indicated that the strategy to improve species richness differed from native cover. Most practitioners believed that reestablishing historic disturbance regimes through prescribed fires and burnings, or sometimes grazing, was the most ideal way to bring back native species richness. Some indicated targeted mowing, and again, maybe high intensity grazing with litter removal could also work where fire is not feasible. 53% of the projects also indicated that starting with larger species palettes or selection would help improve species richness. And about 13% of projects indicated that targeted weeding could also help improve native species richness. One of the really important findings from this study was that coastal prairie restoration may be resulting in what we call regional biotic homogenization. Biotic homogenization is essentially the reduction of biological diversity through the dominance of a few key species. 88% of restoration practitioners across this entire range of restored coastal grasslands that I surveyed indicated they used 8 key species because they believe that they either have better survival or grow faster to help meet project goals. In other words, at a regional scale, species may be becoming more similar because of restoration. In this table, we can see the frequency that these species were used across the projects, where the green end sites represent the northern sites, north of the Golden Gate Bridge. The sea blue sites represent central coast sites, south of the Golden Gate Bridge, but north of San Luis Obispo. And the S orange sites represent southern sites, south in San Luis Obispo and south. It's notable that all species commonly used were perennial grass species, which with the exception of Achillea millefolium, which is a circumboreal perennial orb commonly found in many other habitats across the continent and on other continents. 3 of these species were also used in 50% of these sites or more across these 1,000 kilometer range. And this may also be contributing to some of these issues of perennialization in California grasslands, as I hinted to earlier. And so this is a study that part of it has been published. So if you're interested, there is a review that I wrote with my advisor about how to really think about biotic homogenization and restoration and potential techniques to address this issue. And you can get a free PDF at my website, justinluong.com, if you don't have institutional access to these papers. So overall, we found that grassland restoration was largely successful at reaching project-based goals and achieving a standard performance metric. Although projects were successful at reaching native cover goals and restoring some native species richness, results indicate the full complement of species regionally available are not always being restored. And even though that is not necessarily ideal, this is still really great news that restoration is successful, and it was somewhat surprising to me and many of the practitioners I work and spoke with, because a lot of us actually thought that restoration was being lost to invasive species and competition. However, through the plant surveys and management interviews, there's obviously still major issues with invasive species control in restoration, as it was indicated as the largest barrier to achieving restoration goals and by every project. We also found that non-native species increased with post-implementation age, which means that there may need to be maintenance in the long term to help control for these species. And indeed, through some analyses, we also found that projects with more maintenance often had lower native species, non-native species cover, and often achieved higher native species diversity. Most projects also indicated that that although they reached their project-based goals, they still would have ideally worked more to increase the habitat of their restoration project, the quality of their project, and increase the diversity if they had sufficient resources to do so. We also found that there was difficulty in restoring, as I mentioned, the full complement of species regionally available, which may be caused by several factors. First, similar to what Lesage, Press, and Hull found in endangered species introductions, risk-averse land managers and practitioners may be unlikely to work with particular species that are hard to collect or grow because it could be straining on an already limited budget and also make it more difficult to achieve project goals. And I think that makes sense because I know if it was me and likely many of you, if we set a goal, we probably wouldn't want to fail at what we set out to achieve. So it makes sense they're using their money for what they can and using species that we know will work. But that begs the question of how are we going to address this question in the future? And still, it's really great to know that restoration is successful, and that's a really great first step. And now it's time to figure out how we'll address some of this. So some of this also has to do with a lack of knowledge about annual species that make up a large diversity of our grasslands, because sometimes annual species can have specific disturbance germination cues or only do well in certain rain years, which again can make it hard to reach project-based goals. Aside from a limited budget, to source local materials, sometimes rare plants only produce seeds in large amounts in certain years, and further making them inaccessible. And accordingly, more research will be needed to be completed on rare annual species and just less commonly used species and their life cycles and nursery practice and how to establish them to really incorporate them and make them risk-free for practitioners. Results also indicate that restoration, likely, and conservation, of course, likely needs more money and greater funding support, as indicated by the majority of surveyed restoration projects. Often funding is available to establish restoration projects and increase native cover, but not necessarily for long-term management, maintenance, or monitoring. And we found that long-term maintenance was really important for improving native species diversity to help address this homogenization issue, and also help decrease non-native species cover, which again addresses this growing issue with non-native species over time. Lack of funding also makes it hard for projects to do monitoring and long-term and really adapt practices because there's a lack of information on their previous projects. And so it's really hard to understand how to change your management practices if you don't necessarily know how the practices you used really affected the ecosystem and the system. Multi-year planting and seeding efforts were also indicated to have better success at achieving higher native cover and richness. But again, this requires more funds and more years of work. Increased funding will also likely allow for us to experiment more with, again, these less commonly used species to help reduce the amount of risk and give a little bit of cushion for practitioners and that still need to source native plants for the project. Some potential suggestions that we have that arise from the study are as follows. First, we believe that restoration projects should do their best to try to include additional native species and regionally rare species when possible. Although I do acknowledge that there are limited resources and that can be hard. This could also be addressed from a statutory or legal perspective, where there could be an increased number of native species required within the restoration plan, but not necessarily for establishment. And so this kind of helps, maybe not all the species used need to be present during monitoring, but at least we can introduce a greater amount of diversity and hope to bank more native species seeds for the future in that ecosystem. When possible, we may also want to think more about not only how to include annual forbs, but also regionally rare species and less commonly used species, even like annual grasses that probably were in a lot of our grasslands in the past, like Vasuca microstachies. And actually, interestingly, the one only site that I had that used that species actually had a lot lower cover of the weedy Festuca / Volpia that it looks really similar to. And so it's really important to think about how to use some of these other species because they may also help improve success in certain ways. And although planting is preferred by most practitioners, it is often indicated as infeasible due to the amount of resource needed. And so really thinking about how to improve seeding methods or how to reduce the cost of restoration will also be important in the future. So as I mentioned, there's a big issue with, or there is an issue with species selection and biotic homogenization across this range. And so I'm working to form a working group and eventually a center or agency to coordinate restoration plant selection and also share restoration practices and knowledge in terms of just invasive plant control, nursery practices, and other types of things. To really explore the use of less common species with a shared risk model. And eventually I'll also hope to apply for grants to help support the use of some of these species. And I've also talked to some folks at Hedgerow Farms that may be able to help source some seeds for this type of collaboration. And so I'm really looking for people that are interested and maybe joining this network and really helping to explore this question in the long term, and which so if you're interested, just email me at my email below or any email you see on my website. And this won't start immediately, but I am starting to take names and making a list of people that are interested so we can get this started in a few years. And you can probably tell I really like lupins. They're everywhere. And anyways, I want to thank you all for attending today and listening. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions or feedback. And again, here's my contact info if any of you want to reach out later on. Here is my little grazer, Carl, eating some Stipropulchra in our backyard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. That's the talk is it's fascinating. And many people have been commenting on the impressive work that you've done. We really appreciate you sharing the information that you've gained from so many other projects. But we do have a few questions, and I can go over those with you.
Sure.
Yeah,
my apologies for the dog barking in the background.
No problem. Robin asks, how can the biotic homogenization be prevented?
Yeah, so that's a really complicated question, but it's really going to take time, and really, it's really important, I think, for us for practitioners, I'm no longer a practitioner, but for practitioners, to really figure out a way for us to all coordinate and communicate regionally across projects and when we're doing plant selection, because it's really hard to really know what other people are using. And we probably wouldn't, I personally wouldn't have known this was a phenomenon unless I had done these interviews and talked to everyone across all these sites. And so one way I'm trying to figure out a way to address this is creating this network. And that way, if people are fund limited and they can't get a species, then maybe I can supply the species, and then we can have different practitioners in different areas growing these species, and really seeing, how does this plant grow in this environment? How does it grow with this management practices? And then one of us, or me, can work to really kind of analyze some of this data and share it back out to everyone, to kind of figure out, this is maybe how we establish it. And that could reduce the costs and the risk for people that may be concerned with money or achieving project goals. But, that's just one way that I've been thinking about it. And there's probably other ways as well, but maybe another way would be to kind of provide greater infrastructure for restoration and conservation through the legislature, and providing money for nurseries to really create these networks and these, I guess, making and banking native seed diversity at areas like Hedgerow, and also the Santa Ana Botanic Garden has a huge collection of seeds. And so those are some potential ways, but I'm also open to suggestions.
Great. And Jean asks if you could repeat the information about nitrogen. I think, yeah.
Yeah, so essentially we found that opposite to what we would have expected, soil available nitrogen was positively related to native plant cover and negatively related to non-native plant cover, which means as soil nitrogen increased, plant native cover increased, or it was related to increased native plant cover. And when there was higher plant available nitrogen in the soil, there was lower non-native species cover. And although this is opposite of what we may generally expect, because we think we know that non-native species can thrive with high nutrient environments, some studies that I've been reading have been indicating that non-native species just rapidly take up this nitrogen during the growing season, which is when I sampled the soil, and then they keep that nitrogen in their leaves. And so that's might be why we're seeing lower amounts of nitrogen where there's higher native plant cover. And vice versa with native plants, which are slower with using nitrogen, which is maybe why there's higher nitrogen cover where there's higher native plant cover. But yeah, open to any commentary that anyone might have on that as well.
Interesting. And then, oops, I'm missing something here. Hold on just a second. Judy asks, how many sites collected seeds in order to grow on site or distribute on site for the restoration? So, collecting on site and then reusing that at the same site.
Yeah, I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but it typically was only the very well-funded agencies or large restoration agencies. And so that was about a third of the projects. So for example, where I used to work at the Cheadle Center for Biodiversity, also known as CBER, we have money in perpetuity for restoration. So we collect all our seeds on site for the most part, or if it's not on the site, in a very local way, in like the local watershed. And then we use those, we grow them out at the nursery. The Golden Gate National Recreational Area does the same thing. And so does the Mattole Restoration Council in Humboldt. And that's also because they're so isolated, they have to grow their own plants. Yeah.
Could that be a training issue? Like maybe knowledge?
Yeah, totally. Like a lot of these nursery managers, like the one I used to work with at Santa Barbara, they have a wealth of knowledge in germination and how to grow these plants, which often isn't necessarily written down or recorded or shared, which is also one of these reasons why I want to start this network. Like, for example, we used to use liquid smoke in a can to help germinate some plants, and it worked really well. And so we didn't have to use a fire; we just used the chemical. So yeah, definitely there is a potential for loss of knowledge right now.
Great. And then Karen asks, oops, let's see. Sorry. Sorry, that.
No problem.
Okay, there's another question here. Sometimes coastal grasslands type cover convert to shrublands if there's a lack of grazing or fire. Did you see any of the grasslands moving in that direction? And if not, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, there is a major issue with especially coyote brush invading and encroaching into these perennial grasslands, which I didn't really talk about the fine details of that in this presentation. But at some of these sites, a lot of the native cover was like baccharis, which is not a plant that was planted and often is considered weedy and even sometimes managed in restoration. So yes, there's a major issue with that. And that's another thing that we need to figure out how to control. And oftentimes people have indicated that it's going to be reestablishing disturbance regimes. But currently it's really hard without a lot of funding. And in other areas, like further north, they also have problems with bush lupin after fire. And in other areas, Douglas fir, like in Humboldt, they did some historical GIS analysis and basically found that about like 70 or 80% of their coastal prairies in the King Range basically were converted and encroached into by Douglas fir, which now they're actually working to remove and restore, which is a bit complicated because it's also native. But yes, that is a major issue. And I would love to talk more about that, maybe through email though.
Okay. And then Laura asks, can you talk a little bit about why you think statutory projects had a lower cover, native cover than voluntary projects? Do you think that has to do with a cultural commitment or returning to the project or anything other than legal reasons? And also curious as to why you decided what is a grassland, thinking about a prairie that might work in the Presidio.
So I only focused on grasslands that were well planted and seeded and larger than an acre and also non-serpentine. I did consider the Presidio at a time, but it had a lot of serpentine grasslands that I had to kind of map out and kind of figure that out. And so I decided to exclude that at the time since it had a slightly different soil chemistry. In terms of the statutory projects, I don't want to say too much about that necessarily because I don't want to necessarily upset anyone, but like I said, I can only guess why this is happening. But I will say some of these projects like this consultant, I mean, like not necessarily a consultant, but like a large agency or something like a large chain is hired on, and they have to write the plan and they have to implement it. And then after 5 years, they don't have to deal with it anymore. But the plan does indicate that they have to maintain that native cover over time. And so if you come back and potentially the native cover is below whatever they put in their project and the legal requirement is for it to stay at that level at minimum in perpetuity, then they would have to go back and do additional management, which likely wasn't included in their original project funds. And so I assume that's maybe why I wasn't able to get access to some. But again, it's kind of a sensitive issue, so I don't want to make any too strong of comments on that part of it particularly. In terms of voluntary projects, though, I do know, like, for example, some of these are literally passion projects. So like people are literally doing, like, for example, at one of the sites I work at, back in the 90s, this guy was just really into restoration and they had a slush fund and like they had extra money. So he decided to do restoration. And now that area is managed by more bird-minded people. And so now the extra money generally goes to doing bird surveys or other types of things like that. And so there is, yes, there's some type of, like, in my opinion, people that voluntarily do restoration have a strong commitment to it. And really it's like, I don't know, for me, it feels like if you want to do restoration, and you're doing it out of your own time and money, or you're finding the money to do it, then there's obviously some type of like high level of commitment there, in my opinion.
Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I know it's really late where you are, but if people want to stay after, and I'm happy to keep answering questions until we're all done.
Okay. Well, Kenneth asks, could we expect to see perennialization in the few intact native grasslands that are left in California, perhaps as a response to drought and climate change?
Yes, definitely. So like I mentioned, like some of these annual forbs especially requires disturbance to germinate or open space. And because we don't have the same types of grazers we used to have historically, we don't have prescribed fires, and we have a history of fire suppression. There's a lot less open space in grasslands now, because there's none of that type of management. And so yes, I do think over time we will see biotic homogenization of just remnant grasslands as well through, yes, climate change too. But just because like we don't have disturbance, and California grasslands are a disturbance-driven ecosystem.
And I think, let's see, another question about the oh, just a I guess that was just a comment, not a question. I think that may be about it. So I really appreciate your talk, and we can share the information from the chat with you. A couple of people wanted to connect up, but we really appreciate all of your work and sharing your research with us.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming and attending today and being engaged. And again, email me. I'm always happy to talk. I love talking about restoration. So email me anytime. And I'm sure I'll see some of you again soon. And I'll see you at CNPS in October.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.